For decades upon decades, the magical girl genre was a pretty well-defined one. Magical girls stood for hope and friendship, with shows like Cardcaptor Sakura and of course Sailor Moon being prime examples of this. Now obviously, these shows still cover some dark themes from time to time. Heck, Revolutionary Girl Utena is one of the most chilling stories I've ever seen, and it comes from that very genre. But as a whole, for most of the 80s and 90s, hope and friendship is what the magical girl genre stood for. And yet, when thinking of magical girl shows today, those two words aren't necessarily the first ones you would think of, and it's all thanks to one show. Puella Magi Madoka Magica is, by all intents and purposes, a certified classic at this point. Only having 13 episodes, being released all the way back in 2011, some might think it would slowly be forgotten over time, but that's not the case at all. It's still going strong, with a movie and several spin-offs being released in the almost 15 years since, and a new movie set to release next year. While anime is more popular now than it has ever been before, the 2010s are what many might consider the golden age of anime. The medium had already become popular to a degree where dozens of banger shows were produced every season, but it had not quite yet reached the mainstream appeal and oversaturation that it did during and after COVID. And yet, even with numerous classics such as Attack on Titan, Hunter x Hunter, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, or Steins Gate releasing in and around the same time period, Madoka Magica still remains as one of the most memorable shows of the decade. While several other magical girl shows had shown us different sides of the genre, none have deconstructed it this way. Not simply testing the boundaries of the genre, but tearing them all down, this show has changed the genre to its core to this very day. Today, I will explore how it managed to do that and why, despite not necessarily being the biggest fan of the magical girl genre, this show has become one of my favorite shows of all time. If you like this type of content, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Now, I don't think anyone would disagree with me if I called Madoka Magica a magical girl show. However, I would argue that it also qualifies as a horror show. Twisting familiar tropes of the genre, it uses the viewer's knowledge of it to lure them into a false sense of security. I think the most obvious example of this are the deaths of both Mami and later on Sayaka. Struggle against an evil opponent is obviously a core component of the magical girl genre. One would normally assume that at least the main crew would be very unlikely to die. Mami's death was a tone setter for the entire series, as it showed how brutal and unforgiving the world and the witches these girls fight against are. And her death was so unceremonious. It wasn't like she was up against an overpowered opponent where it would take all of the girls combined to defeat it. She was just overconfident and unfortunately lost her life due to a careless mistake. Sayaka's death, on the other hand, was maybe a bit more predictable. She contracted with Kyubey and used her wish to heal Kamicho's arm, enabling him to play his instrument again. She wanted to get closer to him, after all, and fulfill her dream of a classical romance. However, shortly after, she would find out the truth about her magical contract, making her feel like she could no longer approach him. This leads Sayaka to fall into deep despair, ultimately leading to her soul gem being corrupted, turning her into a witch. The worst part, and the sort of psychological horror aspect of it, is that the other characters in the show, and we, as the audience, can see her slowly getting worse and worse. The paranoia, self-loathing, alienation. But the characters around her seem to be just as powerless as we are to stop it from happening. Another aspect of horror the show incorporates is a sort of body horror that might not be quite as obvious at first glance. Witches are, for all intents and purposes, corrupted magical girls. When a magical girl's gem is corrupted enough, it turns into a grief gem, turning the magical girl into a witch, the very thing they aim to destroy in the first place. The witch's labyrinths, some might assume look the way they do, in order for Studio Shaft to flex their animation muscle and know-how, play into this as well. These pocket dimensions, created by and housing the witches, are a sort of reflection of the magical girl's wishes, mindset, or location where they turned into said witch. So, to sum it up, not only are the witches' labyrinths a perversion of a magical girl's dreams, wishes, and thoughts, but the turning into witches is a perversion of the very essence of what it means to be a magical girl. However, all of that is insignificant when compared to the true horror this series has to offer. Kyubey's existence by itself has influenced and changed the genre as a whole to this day, with viewers now being suspicious of every cute looking mascot in this type of show. While the witches are the ones our protagonists fight against all throughout the show, they are arguably not the main antagonist, at least in my eyes. That title would then have to go to Kyubey or the incubators as a whole. However, what makes the actions even more horrifying is that they don't act out of malice or any feelings toward the human race at all. Cosmic horror is something that has always oddly fascinated me, and it's on full display here. To the incubators, these girls are just like cattle. They use the massive amount of energy they generate to fuel the universe. Yes, thousands of people might die, the magical girls will get corrupted and turn into the thing they swore to fight against, but at the end of the day, they don't really care. Incubators might act like they have emotions to appeal to the girls and manipulate them into a contract, but at its core, they don't have any emotions at all, something that is entirely incomprehensible to us humans. Even the wishes they offer to the girls, while seemingly enticing at first, are nothing but a trap. Each and every one of our 5 main girls had a wish born out of hope or love for another that they twisted into something, creating suffering for themselves or others. I already talked a bit about Sayaka's, but let's mention it again here for completion's sake. Her wish to heal Kyosuke's arm was something that ultimately led to her spiraling into her own self-destruction. However, if you think there was a one-off case, you'd be sorely mistaken. Every other girl's wishes had dire consequences as well. Let's take Mami for an example. Her wish is actually a bit of an outlier, that it isn't quite as selfless as the wishes of most of her other magical girls. Her wish was simply to live, as she got in a car accident with her parents. But while her wish ensured her own safety, her parents weren't quite as lucky, leaving Mami all alone and on her own. One could even argue that this then led to her death. She became overconfident at the thought of not being alone anymore after Madoka told her she would accept the contract. And while Kyoko used her wish expressly to save her family, it ended up having the opposite effect. Her family was poor because no one would go to listen to her father's teachings at church. So she thought it only logical to wish for people to listen to his teachings. However, her father then learned of her activities as a magical girl. He believed those powers were the work of the devil, one day just snapping and killing Kyoko's mother, little sister, and then himself. Kyoko's wish left her all alone with nothing but cynicism and distrust for the people around her. And of course, we can't talk about wishes without talking about the one which caused all of the events in the show to happen. Homura, originally a sickly, shy, timid girl, but transferred into a new school. There, she meets Madoka and Mami, looking up to and befriending them even after finding out they were magical girls. All is going well until Walpurgisnacht appears. Mami dies and Madoka fights the witch by herself in order to save Homura. That's when Homura makes her wish. She wants to redo her meeting with Madoka, saving her instead of being the one who has to be saved. She returns to when they first met, redoing the timeline over and over again in order to save Madoka. She even loses part of her humanity. She would be willing to sacrifice all the other girls just to be able to save her. But with her wish, she doesn't just lose part of her humanity. She also has to go through the pain of losing her loved ones over and over again. However, the most selfless and maybe most painful wish is surely that of Madoka. Her wish actually differs throughout the timelines, But one thing stays the same. It's always a selfless one. However, it's the final wish in particular that I am talking about. Having had enough of all the pain and suffering all the magical girls around the world go through, she turns her wish into a miracle. I want to erase all witches before they are even born. I will erase every single witch in every universe, past and future, with my own hands. I don't care what you call it. All those magical girls who held onto their hopes and fought against witches, I don't want to see them cry. I want them to stay smiling until the end. If any rule or law stands in my way, I will destroy it. I will rewrite it. That is my prayer, that is my wish. Now granted, Incubator. However, to do that, to truly get rid of every witch in the entire universe and end the suffering of all the magical girls out there, she has to sacrifice something important of herself. Her entire self, in fact. She stopped having a physical form, only continuing to exist as this law of cycle, saving all other magical girls but not being able to live a life for herself. In fact, I think Madoka's ascension to godhood is something that is worth exploring in further detail. Sure, she has saved the world, prevented all magical girls from ever turning into witches, but I wonder whether it could truly be called a happy ending despite those successes. She has achieved her dream, yes, but at what cost? She has saved so many others, what I consider the ultimate act of compassion, but in doing so is erasing herself. There are many parallels to real-life religion that can be found in the actions of Madoka. The first will probably be pretty obvious to most. In a very Christ-like manner, she sacrifices herself for humanity, not to get rid of their sins, but to get rid of the magical girl's despair. Now, I imagine most viewers are not too familiar with the Bodhisattvan ideal, but I think it's something that is definitely applicable to Madoka's situation as well. The idea behind it is that a person forgoes achieving a personal nirvana to help another person achieve Buddhahood. Now, if we remove the terms nirvana and Buddha and focus on the essence behind it, one can see the similarities to Madoka's situation. She's staying in a cycle of suffering, taking the burden upon herself in order to save others from it. However, the cost of her ascension goes farther than just sacrificing herself. She doesn't simply die, she's erased from memory, with everyone around her, even her closest friends, forgetting she ever existed, so that no one can even grieve for her. However, there is one exception, Homura. But we, as viewers, can have our own opinions and views on her sacrifice. At the end of the day, we have no way to influence or change what happened. But she can, and she rejects the idea that what Madoka did was the right thing to do. In the movie Rebellion, Homura acts on those feelings. She saves Madoka from divinity, making her mortal once again. She believes that this divinity is just another form of imprisonment and creates her own world, one where Madoka can be alive and happy even if it is fake. Which poses yet another philosophical question. Is what Homura did right? She saved Madoka after all, but only by explicitly denying her her wish. And I think you can't finish a video like this without extensively talking about my favorite and in my opinion most interesting character in the series, Homura. While the story could not have reached its conclusion without Madoka, it could even have started without Homura. I must admit, I'm a huge sucker for time travel, or to be more specific, time loop stories. Heck, my two favorite anime, Re:Zero and Steins Gate, both feature that aspect heavily, so it's no wonder I find myself drawn to this story in a way that I haven't been to others in its genre. And Homura is a huge reason for that. I think it's a very interesting narrative idea to start in what is already the fourth timeline for Homura, and only let the viewers find out about the looping and what happened in those previous loops later on in the story. Homura's development as a person throughout the loops is also quite fascinating. She goes from a shy and kind girl to someone stoic, violent, maybe even borderline sociopathic. And while that might seem like quite an extreme change, I think it is one it is totally understandable. Repeatedly being confronted with the death of one's friends is something that I'm sure would destroy every one of us emotionally. But the reality of the situation is something even more cruel. She knows about the plans of Kyubey and how magical girls are nothing but a source of energy for the incubators. But she is powerless to stop it, to do anything about the incubators. But still, she can't stop looping. Her love for Madoka runs too deep and is too powerful. But in this show, that love is not salvation or hope. It's a shackle on her, forcing her to repeat this nightmare over and over again. Every miracle in Madoka Magica has a price. A soul for a wish, a self for salvation. The series strips away the comforting fantasy of magical girls and asks a difficult question. What are you willing to give up to make the world a better place? For Madoka, the answer was herself. For Homura, it was everyone but Madoka. In the end, both are gods and both are trapped by their own compassion. I wasn't sure exactly what to expect from this show when going into it. Like I said before, I've never been the biggest fan of the genre, but the stories about how good the show was eventually led me to check it out. I don't regret it for a single second. It already cemented itself as one of my favorite shows of all time, and I'm already itching to rewatch it, even though it's only been a few weeks. I guess I'm now in the same boat as all the fans of the series who've been desperately waiting for the new movie for years. Thanks for watching.